Her, and I'm a senior host from the Ontario Science Centre. I'm so happy to be here today with you and with two amazing Canadian scientists. We have Dr. Ellen Kenchington and Dr. Emily Darling. And over the next about 30 minutes or so, we're going to be talking about coral today. Now, the chat is open, so we'd love to hear where you're watching from today. And you can also post any questions you have, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can near the end of our chat today. Now, please remember, though, that any inappropriate comments will be removed and blocked. So thanks ahead of time for helping us to create a place where we can have an open, respectful conversation and learn together. Now, I want to begin today with a land acknowledgement. And as you may have guessed, I'm not at the Science Centre right now, but I am in Toronto, which is where the Ontario Science Centre is located. And the Ontario Science Centre sits on the lands and territories of many nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. And this land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As a settler myself, I am truly grateful to be able to live and work on this land alongside the Indigenous peoples who have cared for it since time immemorial. And some of you may be joining today from places outside of Toronto, outside of Ontario. So I really encourage everyone to learn about the peoples and the treaties and the histories of the land that you're living on. Two resources that I've found helpful as a starting point are whos.land and native-land.ca. And land acknowledgements, they aren't just symbolic, they're really important. They're a good reminder to think about our histories and how we engage with each other and our responsibilities to respect and care for the land. And this includes its waters and its oceans, which is what we're here to talk about today. Now, tomorrow is April 22nd, and that's Earth Day, which is another wonderful reminder of our responsibility to our environment. And the theme for Earth Day this year is Restore Our Earth, which is really fitting since today we're going to be talking about conservation of coral in our oceans. We're going to take a deeper dive, it's a terrible pun, into the world of coral today with our two guests. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ellen Kenchington. She is a benthic ecologist working with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Bedford Institute of Oceanography. She's joining us all the way from Nova Scotia today. Hi, Ellen.
Hi.
And I'd also like to welcome Dr. Emily Darling, a coral reef scientist and the Director of Coral Reef Conservation with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And she's joining us from Toronto as well, though she's usually working all around the world in tropical coral reefs. Hi, Emily.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. And now, before we get to know our guests a little better, I have a question for everyone. What do you think of when you hear coral? So you can write your thoughts in the chat. And I'm sure Finding Nemo has had probably a little bit of influence here. Oh, sorry, that question's for a little later. And while the audience is typing away, I have probably some younger viewers tuning in today. So they probably want to know what led to you studying coral. Emily, was there something that inspired you when you were young?
Sure. Well, I think the one thing that inspired me the most was actually not coral, but organisms we associate with coral often, which are fish. So I fell in love with fish markets as an 8-year-old. My parents were living overseas. They took me with them. And when we would visit the markets to buy fruits or vegetables, I was just stunned by the fish markets. There would be piles of shimmering squid, of white octopus with blue, bright blue dots. And I was and of course, fish of all different kinds of colors. And so I was just so fascinated with where these fish came from that were so important to the people in these markets. And it turned out that a lot of those fish came from coral reefs. And that was what really got me inspired to learn more about coral reefs and eventually to become a coral reef conservation scientist.
Amazing. It's neat to hear how something as simple as a fish market really led to a whole career working in the ocean. And what about you, Ellen? Did you always plan to study coral, or how did that come about?
No, not at all. In fact, I'm kind of surprised myself that I'm studying coral now. But I actually grew up in Windsor, Ontario, so I didn't get much chance to really see corals when I was younger. But we did get some trips to Nova Scotia to see relatives and get into the ocean. And I really loved walking at the low tide where I could see seaweeds and crabs and jellyfish and things that were in the water. And I started my work there. I actually went to school in Australia where I studied seaweeds and then came back to Canada and continued to work on seaweeds. And then as different questions came up and I started to work for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, I ended up going deeper and deeper and deeper. And I left the seaweeds behind. And now I'm working on deep water coral that live about a kilometer below the surface. So I'm in really deep water and not hot water yet, but deep water.
That's so neat. I've loved hearing what inspired you and how sort of the circuitous route to end up
Yeah.
deeper and deeper into the ocean. And I can see when some of our viewers posting in the comments here, they think of the barrier reef, they think of the ocean and fish. So that's definitely on par. And we have people tuning in from Germany, even Bowmanville, Oakville, some groups from
Wow.
Russia, Ottawa, all over. And so actually for everyone tuning in today, I have a question for you, another question for everyone watching. So what is coral? And I think we have a question here. Yep. So is it a rock, a plant, or an animal? And you can write your answers in the chat and you can choose more than one answer. So I'm really curious to see what people think here. It's interesting. I can see maybe some answers starting to come in. And I was wondering, Emily, can you help us with this one? I know you study tropical coral. So what is coral?
Sure, great question. Well, I'm first going to take you to tropical coral reefs. So these are warm water reefs that exist in a belt around our planet. And I think there's a next slide. And I hope I can convince you that when we dive underwater, like you see here on a coral reef, that a coral that I'm going to be talking about today is actually an animal, a plant, and a mineral. So it's a great trivia question because it's actually all three. So, for example, a coral is actually, next click, a jellyfish. So a coral is an animal that's very closely related to a jellyfish. And in fact, if you shrunk that jellyfish down, you turned it upside down, and then you lived with all of your upside down small jellyfish relatives, this is what a coral colony is. So a coral colony or a coral is an animal because you've got this jellyfish-like animal. It's also a plant because in the tissues of this jellyfish live microalgae called zooxanthellae, and they fuel the coral with energy from the sun through photosynthesis. And then also a coral is a mineral. Coral animals secrete calcium carbonate backbone, and this provides the architecture of the entire coral reef. So here you can see a whole bunch of different colonies, and that eventually provides the underwater structure of a coral reef. And that, of course, supports lots of incredible fish, just like the ones I saw in the fish market or the ones that you'd see when you're diving underwater on a coral reef. So coral, for the tropical corals that I'm going to be telling you about, is both an animal, a plant, and a mineral.
That's amazing. And I can see some of our viewers today managed to guess all three together. So that's really, really good prediction on their part. Now I know, Ellen, that Canada is definitely not tropical. We've just come out of a wonderful winter, and I've been in the ocean off of BC and the water was really cold. I didn't know that we had coral here, but we do. And so I'm going to have a question for our viewers first before I ask you something else. But we have our next slide with a picture. And since there's corals here in Canada, which of these coral do you think are from Canadian waters? And you can write your answers in the chat, and you can choose more than one. And while they're answering that, Ellen, are Canadian coral the same as tropical coral? How are they the same, or how are they different?
They're different, and one of the biggest differences is that they don't have the plant cells, the zooxanthellae that Emily's been telling us about. And what that means is that they can live in really deep water. Corals that have plant cells living inside of them need to be in the sunlit waters so that the plants can thrive. But when those are gone, as they are in the Canadian corals, we call them cold water corals, they can live into really deep waters, and some of them live down to 3 kilometers below the surface, although they form habitats like some of the pictures here at about 1 kilometer. And they can also live in shallow water, but these very large corals, some of them are over a meter tall, they're found in the deeper water. And that's the biggest difference. And because they don't have the plant cells to help them with their food supply, they have to catch all of the food on their own. So they really need to be found in places where there's a good and continuous source of food raining down from the surface.
For sure. And I can see some of our visitors out there. I see lots of A and C guesses coming in. Can we reveal the answer to see which of these? Wow. So it's all of B, C, and D are all corals that are found in Canadian waters. And I was wondering, Ellen, if we can go through now some of the other coral that are found and look at them a little more closely. So let's see. I think we have a picture here. Yes, awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about these corals?
Yeah. So corals are found in all of Canada's 3 oceans. So they're in the Pacific, in the Arctic, and in the Atlantic. And these corals here are some of our more exciting corals because they're so tall. The one called the bubblegum coral there, it can be up to 5 meters tall, and the fishermen sometimes call them trees. They're that big. The other coral on the lower left side of the picture is called sea corn, and that's another name that the fishermen have called them, because the fishermen were often the first ones to identify that we had these corals. They were aware of where they were long before the scientists came into the picture. And these corals here that you're seeing, they're found on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts with some different species, but very similar forms to this. But there are many shapes and sizes of coral. The next slide has a nice picture, I think, of a coral called a bamboo coral. And this one is also quite large. It can be up to 1.5 meters tall. And you can see it's got a different kind of branching form. But it's called bamboo coral because its skeleton underneath that fuzzy surface where the tentacles are is a kind of made up of a piece of white, and then it has a black band, a protein, and then another white calcium carbonate structure, and it looks like a piece of bamboo. So it's really beautiful even when it's dead. And the next slide. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying it's really beautiful. There's so many different shapes, and this looks way different than the other ones you're showing. It looks almost soft and flowy.
These are beautiful. This is a kind of coral called a sea pen, and they're called a sea pen because they look like those old-fashioned pens made out of feathers that you might have seen pictures of. And here you can see one with just the top part, the feather part, sticking out of the sand. And underneath the sandy bottom, it's actually has a root that goes straight down, and it can be quite deep, and it anchors the coral into this soft sediment there. And you can see a little fish is snuggled up next to it, which is very common. We see a lot of fish resting beside these corals, especially in sandy areas where there's not a lot of other things around where they can get out of the way of the currents and hide from predators. And the close-up there, that shows you the tentacles. So remember I said that the corals in Canada have to capture their food? Well, this one's really good at it. It's got these really long tentacles that it waves in the water and waits for the particles and little animals to come by, and then it grabs them. And you can see there's one tentacle up at the top where the tentacles are all closed up, and that's probably got some food there that it's starting to eat.
Having its lunch. Awesome. And I think there's one final slide here that we have. Now that says black coral, but it looks very orange to me. Can you tell me what's going on there?
So this is another one like the bamboo coral. It's called black coral because underneath the orange polyps or tentacles, it has a black skeleton. And black corals are among the longest lived corals. All corals of the kinds that I've been showing you here are very long lived. Some of them live hundreds of years. But these black corals, this particular type of Coral has been aged to 4,320 years. So these are like the redwoods of the ocean. They're really long-lived, and they also grow very slowly because in cold waters, things grow slowly. And that's why they are so important that we have to protect them. And you see some other little corals in the background. Those are called mushroom corals because they look like mushrooms. So that's another type of coral there. So there's two in one on this slide.
Very cool. It's just beautiful to see such an amazing variety of shapes and colors. And it's so fascinating that way. Now that we've seen some examples of coral, I was very curious about how do you study these corals? So we'll start with Emily. How do you study coral?
Sure. Well, I think the next photo that we're going to show gives you a picture of my office on a very lucky day. And so this is a photo from Western Province in the Solomon Islands, which is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's in between Australia and Fiji. And all of coral reef science work and coral reef conservation work, it always starts above the water, working in partnerships with local communities, local scientists, local decision makers. So it really takes teams of people who are committed to coral reefs and to marine resources to make sure that we understand these ecosystems and do our best to manage and protect them sustainably so that they continue to provide for us into the future. So once we're above water, that's where we get all of our important dive gear together to be able to go study coral reefs underwater. So the next slide, I'm going to show you what it looks like to be a coral reef scientist underwater. So these are two of my colleagues at WCS, and you can see that they have brought their air under the water with them. So you can see on their back are diving cylinders, and that's where we can keep about an hour of compressed air literally on our back, so carrying our air around us like a turtle. The hoses coming out from that tank are what allow us to breathe. And so we always keep those in our mouth so we're able to breathe freely when we're underwater. And then what we're holding are clipboards, pencils, connected by rubber bands, and underwater paper where we record our observations about the health and biodiversity of coral reefs. So here we're doing some rapid surveys where we're eyeballing an approximately 2 meter square area on the reef, and then we're recording on our slates or on our clipboards the number of different coral species, perhaps their size, information about their health, whether they're healthy and normal, whether they might show signs of stress or bleaching. And we spend our whole hour underwater recording information like this. Other times we might bring down transect lines with us, run those across the reef, and then we measure, and then we count the fish on either side of the transect line. So how big they are, how small they are, the diversity of those fish as well. So that gives us two really important pieces of information about the health of a coral reef. The first is the amount of living hard coral cover. So those are those hard coral colonies that make up the backbone of the reef. And the more living coral cover you have, the healthier typically a reef is. And the second thing we measure is what is the biomass of coral reef fish on the reef. And biomass just means the wet weight. So from our transect, if we summed up the weight of all of those fishes we observed, how much biomass is on the reef. And typically healthier coral reefs have more reef fish biomass. And that helps keep the coral reef ecosystem in balance and functioning.
That's amazing. It's really neat to see that, like the actual picture of you diving down there, and it's neat to hear how low tech it is too, just pencils and papers initially. Now, Ellen, you mentioned that Canadian corals are located very deep in the ocean. Can you dive down to see Canadian corals, or how do you study them?
Well, you can dive. There are corals living in the shallow waters, so you can do much like Emily's described, but not for the big corals that you've seen the pictures of. Those are called, the shallower ones are called soft corals, and they're only very small and typically don't form really big habitats. But we do have one coral reef in Canada, just one, but it's made of a cold water coral and it's found off Nova Scotia, but it's not in diving depths. It's about 200 meters below the surface, and that's considered shallow in my world. So for me to go out and when I have to study corals, it's really difficult because we can't go out and see them. So we have to take a ship to get out to where they're found, where the water's deep enough. I'm really lucky because I work for the Department, which includes the Canadian Coast Guard. So we can get one of our excellent Coast Guard ships to go out and help us in this exploration. And by the way, if you're interested to see how all this works in Canada, there is going to be a link posted that you can see a full video afterwards of everything that we do, from going out on the ship to using one of these tools, which I'll tell you about in a second, to actually seeing the coral underwater. So have a check that out later. But for how we actually look at them, there are three choices. You can go down in a submarine, which I've done. I've actually been in a submarine down to look at the coral. Or you can use a robot, like the photo on the left. So that is, I call it a robot. It's a remotely operated vehicle. And what happens is the operators are sitting up in the control rooms on the ship, and they can actually steer the robot down on the sea floor, the direction that it goes into, and also kind of like the spacecraft, it has mechanical arms, and they can control the arms and use the arms to collect samples and take photos and so on. So it's my favorite tool. And then if we're just trying to do things a little bit more cheaply, we can use this camera, which is the picture on the right, and that's called a drop camera. So this is just a camera that has a lot of protection around it, and also some other instruments on it to measure the temperature and so on. And when it hits the bottom, it takes a photo, and then we bring it back up, and we don't get to see what's happening on the seafloor until we get the camera back on the surface and can download all the photos. But with the ROV, or the Ropos robot, we can do lots of really cool things. So I love that. And it's actually made in Canada. So it was made out in British Columbia, and I've wanted to use it in Atlantic Canada. It comes right across the country by truck, and we fit it out on one of our ships, and off we go.
That sounds so neat. It sounds like almost like what they used to study the Titanic originally. And I
It's
think
exactly the same. Yeah.
we have some photos, I think, of how the coral is sampled too. Let's see here. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There.
So you can just see the little pictures on the manipulator arm of the robot. So they're able to use this. The drivers, they're very skilled. They don't let people like me drive it, but the owners drive it. I don't even have a learner's permit. I have to just sit in the background and tell them what I want to do. But they can go in and they can take a little snip off the coral. So in this example, I was really interested in looking at the genetics of the coral to see how they're related to one another. And we were able to take just a little piece without damaging it and drop it into one of those little pots you can see there. So later when it came back up on board the ship, I knew exactly where that coral came from on the seabed, and I had a picture to go with it, and I could then do my analysis in a very detailed way. So it's just amazing what you can do underwater, and this is all happening a kilometer below the surface. And so it's really exciting to do this kind of work, and I think every time I go down, it's like a big adventure, a new exploration.
That's amazing. I love the little robot hands there. And now we've talked a little bit about how you study these coral, and I was wondering, Ellen, what role does coral play in these deep water environments? Why is it important? And I think we have a picture that might help make this clear to us here. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so corals call ecosystem engineers, and I think the same is very much true for the tropical ones. And this is my favorite ecosystem engineer, if you know, our beaver. And this little guy or girl, when they go out and build their dams, like you see here, really change the environment. They change the water level, they change the kind of species that can live there, the temperature, and all kinds of things about the habitat. And they're called engineers because they're actually modifying the environment when they're present. And that's what corals do. So whether they're forming reefs or whether they're forming what we call forests or sea pen fields, when they're growing in a density or sort of large number of them together, they actually modify the environment. And the biggest way that deep water, cold water corals in Canada do that is they provide homes for other species.
Oh, and I think
Slide.
we have a question for our audience about this one.
Yes. Okay. Let's see what they think.
Yeah. Can you find anyone hiding in this coral? And let's see if they can notice or anything hiding in there. I wonder. And I see some guesses coming in. I've seen someone say an animal. I see a lobster. Let's reveal. Let's see what's in there. Oh,
you're right.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's a shrimp. And that's just one of many species. We recently did a study and we found over 200 different species living associated with the coral. So there are many different kinds, but this little fella is camouflaged so well. You can see its pink color is very similar to, which means that things that are looking for it to feed on, trouble seeing it. Same time, it's nicely snuggled in there, and when the food passes by, it's able to help itself to some of the food. So it's got a good life, I think, living in that coral.
Yeah, and I think we have another picture of the coral. These look a little different than they did before. They don't have sort of those little tentacle type things sticking out anymore. What's happened here?
That's right. So if you remember the slide that we showed at the beginning with the upside down jellyfish shrunk down to grow together and form a colony. Well, here you can see the each of the individual polyps are all retracted into the skeleton of the coral. So you can kind of see little dimples on the top, and that's where the polyps have retracted. So when the polyps are out, they're feeding, and when they're retracted like this, they're resting. They're either digesting the, in this case, the camera and the lights sort of startled it. But this is what it looks like when the polyps are retracted. And you can see now why this is called a bubblegum coral. The little knobs on it are really rounded, and they look very much like the bubblegum you can get in a machine. And all those yellow circles are around different shrimp. So lots and lots of them on this colony.
That's amazing. People who are watching, let us know how many shrimp you were able to find on this coral. I counted about 10 or 11, but there might even be more. See if you could have spotted them all. Now we know that these reefs provide, coral provides habitat for other species. Emily, what about tropical coral reefs? How are they important?
Great question. Well, tropical coral reefs are also critical habitat for ocean biodiversity and these important ecosystem engineers. So coral reefs only occupy 1% of the surface of our planet, but provide homes for over a quarter of all marine species. So they have disproportionate impacts on taking care of species like these fish you see here. So this is a hawkfish and a blenny, and you'll notice that they're hiding inside the different branches of a coral. And that's because corals provide them with structure where they can hide from predators to avoid being eaten. Another way to avoid predators and being eaten is, next slide, is to hitch a ride. So you might be able to see some tiny yellow pilotfish right at the head of this whale shark. And so here, these yellow pilotfish are following the whale shark because animals that might eat the yellow fish are not going to come near that big shark. And in return, the sharks don't eat the yellow pilotfish because they clean the shark of any parasites that might also be hitching a ride. So coral reefs are crucial in terms of the habitat they provide and these fascinating stories of nature that are around them. But one of the most important reasons of why coral reefs are important is for people. And in fact, coral reefs provide more than 500 million people on our planet with food, medicine, income, and coastal protection. So coastal fisheries with the fish that live on those coral reefs are a crucial source of food security and especially nutritional security. This puts food on the table for coastal families, and it's also an important source of jobs and livelihoods. So selling fish through small-scale fisheries is one of the main occupations for many people in coastal communities. Other livelihoods might include tourism. So maybe you've been fortunate enough to visit a coral reef and go snorkeling. I bet you had a local guide who was able to take you onto the reef and show you some of its best sites. That's an example of coral reefs providing local livelihoods or local jobs through tourism. So really, one of the reasons we're so excited about coral reefs and why it is so crucial to make sure we protect and manage and conserve them is for their biodiversity benefits through the fish and the whale sharks that you saw earlier, and also for human well-being. And so that interplay of sustainability between nature and people, that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to be a coral reef scientist.
That's amazing. It sounds like there's so many important benefits that we get from coral reefs. It's really hard to imagine what the ocean and what our lives would be like without them. But I do know that they're facing so many challenges right now. Emily, what is the biggest threat facing tropical reefs at this time?
So to tropical coral reefs, the biggest threat they're facing is climate change. And that's because corals live in the tropics where it's already pretty hot. And in fact, they live at the limits of their temperature thresholds. And so with climate change, that's continuing to push the ocean temperature beyond what corals can tolerate. And so I think we've got a video here to show you what that looks like. What you're going to see here is a video from 2 months ago in the Solomon Islands, where I took you earlier. And what I'm going to show you is a major bleaching event. So bleaching is a sign of stress from climate change, and it's when corals lose their beautiful colors and turn white. And that's because they've lost that important symbiosis with the zooxanthellae algae, which give them their color. So what you're seeing here is just the skeletons of the coral animal and their limestone. And these corals are starving to death because they no longer have that energy from the sun through those zooxanthellae. So we are so concerned about climate change, and I'm going to tell you some of the things that we're doing about it, I think later in this conversation. But this is why we're worried about climate change as a major threat. It's not necessarily a death sentence for corals through bleaching, but it certainly is a big problem that they're facing, in addition to some of the local pressures of unsustainable use that can compound these effects of climate change.
It was that video was so stark, just seeing the white sort of skeletons of the coral. It's very impactful and very jarring. Ellen, are deep water corals in Canada facing the same threats? How are they doing?
Well, I mentioned before the one coral reef that we know about in Canada, and it also has an outer skeleton like the ones you've just seen from the Solomons. So it's vulnerable to what's called ocean acidification. And I think anybody who'd like to learn more about that, the Science Center has a really cool link for an experiment you can try at home to see what the effects of ocean acidification are on species like corals that have these skeletons outside of their main bodies. So certainly climate change is an important factor to consider, but most of the corals live in deep water where the effects of climate change in Canada are going to be slower and not as extreme as they are in the shallower waters. Instead, one of the biggest threats to corals in Canadian waters is through fishing. So not all fishing, but some fishing involves pulling a net and rollers to keep it on the bottom over the seafloor to catch the fish that live near the bottom. And when they do that, they often bring up other species that they don't really want to catch, and that includes corals. And you can see these big coral trees, the bubblegum coral here. These are hundreds of years old, each of them, very, very slow growing, and these are massive, massive corals. And they've been brought up in fishing gear. And so what we've tried to do in Canada is to map where the corals are living and to talk to the fishermen and try to get their views on being able to avoid them, because they don't want to catch them in their nets either. Can you imagine getting a coral tree like that in your net? It's going to rip the net apart. Your fish is going to be messed, you won't be able to sell it. And so they're quite willing and interested in helping us find out where the corals live and how to protect them. And so a lot of the work I've been doing out here in Nova Scotia has been to find out first where they live, and then to look at where people are fishing and where they overlap. And then because I work for government, we've been able to put in some protections around them right away. So that's been really exciting for my team to be able to go from a discovery and sort of explorer mode right into being able to protect them. And we now have what we call marine refuges in Canada, and we have over 35 of them in Atlantic Canada put in place to protect coral and sponge habitats. And a lot of that has been from the work that has been done with my team. So it's been really, really exciting to see that. But certainly fishing is an important threat to these, and it's one we've got a good handle on in Canada so far.
That's really wonderful to hear that you've been directly involved, like your research has been involved in taking steps to protect Canadian coral. That's so wonderful to hear that you're a part of that, Ellen. Emily, I know the focus of your research and your work is on coral conservation as well. And you've mentioned that there is hope. Could you share some of what you found or how you and your team are working to protect reefs?
Absolutely. Just like Ellen, we're using science to help us discover and protect coral reefs as well. So if we think back to that bleaching video, one of the most important things we can do for coral reefs is find cool spots for them in the ocean. So where are coral reefs currently living in cool spots that might act like a refuge to climate change? So give them longer in terms of being able to withstand these rising temperatures. So we use science to help us identify and discover where are climate refuges around the world. So like I mentioned, when we're underwater, we're using a lot of low-tech equipment. You saw rubber bands, pencils, clipboards, but the technology piece comes into it when we come above the water. So me and my teams have been developing a new technology called Mermaid. And this is a tool that scientists around the world can enter their coral reef monitoring data into and instantly see how the health of their coral reef compares to others around the world. We're then able to link that into other data layers collected by satellites like sea surface temperature or the depth of reefs nearby, and try to pinpoint where are coral reefs going to survive climate change and what conditions can help create these cool spots. So that's a part of our science and discovery. And just last year, we published a study looking at 2,500 reefs across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and we found climate refuges in 23 countries. And they were distributed across these big oceans. So it's really important that we can still have a network of climate refuges that can help protect coral reefs moving into the future. And then, of course, we have to think about management and protection, like Ellen was talking about. So once we're working or we found climate refuges, we have to ensure that they're sustainably managed. And we, in terms of a global community or global citizens of planet Earth, we can all work together on that in terms of strengthening fisheries management, making sure that there's clean water quality going onto reefs, and supporting local governments and national governments in enacting sustainable policies. So all of those things working across different scales, from local climate refuges and local management into connecting refuges into global networks for coral reef conservation. Those are all going to give coral reefs the best fighting chance to climate change.
It's amazing to know that there are these bright spots, that there is hope, and to see how you've really connected and collaborated with scientists from around the world and with communities to like really come up with solutions and work together. Now, I know Emily and Ellen, you've shared so much information and knowledge with us today and given us lots to think about. So I know the audience has some questions for you, and we're going to take some of those now. So make sure if anyone has any few questions, get those into the chat. I have a question here, and Ellen, I'll start with you. How many types of coral are there? I think we might have touched on this, but in Canada, I guess, how many types of coral?
Well, we're still discovering new species almost every time we go to a new place or go a little deeper. But we know so far there are 80 coral species been discovered from British Columbia. And in Atlantic Canada, we have fewer species than we have in the Pacific Ocean in general, like across all kinds of different animals and plants. But we've identified about 30 different corals so far. So quite a few. It was quite a large diversity.
Emily, I hesitate to ask because I'm guessing there's many tropical corals. Do you know how many tropical corals there are, roughly?
Yes, there are estimated to be about 1,000 species of tropical reef building corals, but those are the hard coral species. So in some of my photos, you might have seen things that looked softer or like soft corals. And there's also a whole set of related animals called soft corals. But in terms of hard corals, there's about 1,000 species.
Oh my. Is there, Annie Savarin wants to know, what is the most common species of coral? Emily, is there like some of the most common ones maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the most common species that you see on a reef is going to depend on the history of that reef. So on a reef that is exposed to just enough sunlight and the perfect temperatures and great water quality, you're likely going to see a lot of branching and plating corals. Those are in the Acropora family. Whereas on a reef that's been more stressed, so maybe there's more sediments coming in from a river, or there's more people using the reef, then typically we see a shift in the dominant type of coral towards more of a boulder coral or a parietes coral. And so as a coral reef community ecologist, learning about the dominant types of coral on a reef can tell us a lot about what that reef has been through and how resilient it is to future stressors. So that is a great question, asking about what kind of corals live on a reef.
Awesome. And Ellen, Mrs. BAM's students would like to know if corals have a nervous system in them. It's a very specific question there.
Not in the way you're thinking of, in the sense of proper nerve structures, but they do communicate using electrochemical signaling, and which is, I guess, using hormones or chemicals in their body. And that's why, if you remember that picture of the bubblegum coral, all of the polyps together were shut. And that's because it was a coordinated reaction right across the colony. So they had communicated between each other to be able to do that.
That's amazing. That's really neat. And I have one final question for Emily. And this is an interesting one. Can coral reefs be established or reestablished? And this is from Miss Austin's students.
Oh, great question. So coral reefs are natural recoverers. So after stress, corals in particular can do a great job at recovering. So that's one way that they can reestablish after stress. Corals are also great swimmers when they're baby corals. So adult corals, as we know, are stuck to the reef, but baby corals live freely in the water column for up to a couple months. And so they can actually be great swimmers and swim tens of kilometers away and establish themselves on new reefs. So that's one way that reefs can be connected through dispersal, and one way that corals might strike out and find new habitat with climate change. As waters warm in some of the cooler parts of our ocean, those might end up being decent habitat for future corals. But why coral reefs establish and recover, that's on the cutting edge of coral reef science and conservation right now. So if you're keen on those questions, I would definitely encourage you to be a coral reef scientist like us. It's a ton of fun.
Amazing. We had so many wonderful questions from our audience. I wish we had more time. If your question wasn't answered live, we will do our best to get to any questions left in the chat over the next few days. And I do have one final question for both Ellen and Emily before we wrap up. We've learned so much from you about coral, its importance, the threats it's facing. And a lot of our viewers may be in Ontario or in other places surrounded by land. What can we do to help protect coral reefs? What's one last thing that you want everyone watching to remember or take away from today's live? Ellen?
Well, for me, I think it's really important that people living in the interior parts of Canada know about corals, because they're really not very well known in Canada. I saw in the very first slide, a lot of people didn't realize that we even had corals like we do here. And even people living on our oceans aren't necessarily aware. So my I guess, mission, if you like, is to really share as many of these amazing photos as I can with people so that you can see what we have as part of our natural heritage. And I think, to me, awareness and knowing that we have these in our Canadian waters is very important for their future conservation, so that you care about them as much as I do.
And what about you, Emily? I'd love to hear from you too.
Well, thank you. I think there's so much hope for coral reefs and for our oceans out there. We protect what we know and what we love. And so I'd say if you're excited about the ocean, learn about it, learn about coral reefs. They're such wonderful places. And then tell your friends and family about all the things that you're learning. Another thing we can do is when we learn about the threats to our ocean, we've got to do something about it. So climate change is the biggest threat facing coral reefs and likely our entire planet. And so that means we need to learn about climate change. We need to learn what kinds of actions we can do to reduce not only our own footprints, but call on our politicians to also reduce the footprints of our country as Canadians and join global and international agreements to reduce climate change and really help save our planet.
That's it. Thank you for that. It's wonderful to hear that we can do things, that there are steps that we ourselves can take to make change, even if we don't live near an ocean, and that there is hope for coral and our coral reefs. Thank you so much, Ellen and Emily, today for taking the time to share with us. It was really wonderful to hear about your work in the field and see your beautiful photos that you shared, and to learn so much about coral and coral reef conservation ahead of Earth Day. Thank you also to everyone in the audience for tuning in. And a shout out, I see we have to Miss Ziakis's class. I hope you're all feeling inspired to learn more about the amazing biodiversity of coral reefs and to take action to protect them. And I know Ellen mentioned earlier, one of our activities, the Science Center has many activities that you can do at home to learn more about coral. My current favorite one, and the one that Ellen mentioned, is, and it's very relevant to our discussions today, is an activity that mimics the effects of ocean acidification using eggshells, water, salt, and vinegar, all things that you have at home. And you can find this activity and many more, as well as information on future live stream events and recordings of past live streams like this one, and other great science content on our website, www.ontariosciencecentre.ca. And we've also posted these links in the chat, as well as the resources that Emily and Ellen had mentioned. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our social channels. And thank you one last time to our guest speakers, Dr. Ellen Kenchington, Dr. Emily Darling, and to everyone who has tuned in. I hope to see you again soon at another Ontario Science Centre event. Our next live stream